Your Honor, this woman can't even afford proper meals. These innocent children go to bed hungry because of her neglect. My ex-husband's lawyer stood in the middle of the courtroom, his manicured finger pointed straight at me, like I was some kind of criminal on trial. Each word landed like a physical blow, one after another, until I could barely breathe. The judge leaned forward, his eyebrows drawn together in what looked like genuine concern, and in that single expression, I felt my entire world starting to collapse. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of financial irresponsibility and neglect, Mr. Thornley continued, waving a thick folder in the air, stuffed with what I knew were doctored photographs and carefully manipulated bank statements. My client has documented empty refrigerators, bounced checks, and children wearing damaged clothing to school. These kids deserve better than a mother who prioritizes her own needs over theirs. I tried to speak. My mouth opened, but it was as if someone had filled my throat with cement. No sound came out. My public defender, Ms. Delaney, sat beside me, frantically shuffling through her papers, her face tight with stress. It was painfully obvious she was overwhelmed. Across the aisle, Garrett sat comfortably in his seat, wearing that familiar smirk, the same one he used to flash whenever he knew he'd twisted my words into something ugly and won an argument at my expense. Furthermore, Mr. Thornley's voice boomed, echoing off the courtroom walls, we have testimony from neighbors who've seen these children digging through their backpacks for snacks because there was no breakfast at home. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. My hands curled into fists under the table as my heart pounded in my ears. Those so-called neighbors were Garrett's golf buddies. They'd never even set foot inside my apartment. But how could I prove that? How could I explain that truth in a room where lies sounded so polished and convincing? Judge Wendell turned his gaze to me. Mrs. Morrison, these are serious allegations. Do you have anything to say in your defense? My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the table. 7 years of marriage to Garrett had taught me one painful lesson. Defending myself only ever made things worse. He had a talent for turning my explanations into weapons. But this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about Rosalie and Colton. Your Honor, I managed, my voice shaking. I work 2 jobs to provide for my children. Every penny I earn goes to their care. These are excuses, Garrett suddenly snapped, even as his lawyer tried to hush him. She's always making excuses. Our kids need stability, not a mother who's never home. That was when I heard it. A small voice, clear and steady, slicing through the tension like a blade through silk. Your Honor, may I say something? Every head in the courtroom turned at once. There, standing in the 3rd row of the gallery, was my 9-year-old daughter, Rosalie. She was wearing the purple dress I'd bought her for her school concert last spring, the one she said made her feel brave. Beside her sat her little brother Colton, his hands folded carefully in his lap, wearing his favorite dinosaur tie that he insisted made him look like a lawyer on TV. Young lady, please sit down. This is a legal proceeding, the bailiff said gently, stepping toward her. Rosalie didn't sit. Instead, she lifted a shoebox in both hands. It was the same one she'd decorated with glitter and magazine cutouts for her 4th grade memory project. Your Honor, she said, her voice trembling just slightly but never breaking. My name is Rosalie Morrison. That's my mom over there, and I have something really important you need to see. Judge Wendell raised his hand, stopping the bailiff mid-step. What's in the box, Rosalie? She took a deep breath. When she spoke again, her voice was clear and strong. Receipts, Your Honor, the ones Daddy told me to hide from Mommy's lawyer. He said if I kept them secret and told everyone Mommy doesn't feed us, he'd buy me a new iPad and take us to Disney World. The courtroom went completely silent. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Garrett's face drained of color, going from smug to ghostly pale in seconds. That's ridiculous, he shouted, jumping to his feet. She's making things up. Kids have wild imaginations. Bethany obviously coached her. Mr. Morrison, Judge Wendell cut in sharply, his voice like glass, you will remain silent unless addressed directly. Continue, young lady. Rosalie stepped forward, each movement deliberate. This was my daughter, The same child who still slept with a nightlight, who asked me to check under her bed for monsters, standing tall in a courtroom full of adults who'd been deciding her fate without ever asking her opinion. "Daddy came to our house when Mommy was at work," she said, opening the box. "He took food from our freezer and our pantry. He threw it in the dumpster behind our building. I know because I followed him and took pictures with the phone Grandma Vera gave me before she died." She pulled out a stack of slightly blurry photos. But they were clear enough to show Garrett carrying garbage bags from our apartment to the dumpster. Clear enough to show unopened packages of chicken, vegetables, cereal boxes, and gallons of milk being thrown away. "Rosalie," Judge Wendell said gently, "why didn't you tell anyone about this sooner?" Her composure cracked just a little. Tears shimmered in her eyes. "Because Daddy said if I told anyone, the judge would be angry and send me and Colton to different foster homes," she said softly. "He said we'd never see Mommy or each other again." "But yesterday," Rosalie continued, her small voice gaining strength again, "my teacher, Mrs. Brennan, taught us about truth and justice in social studies. She said, 'Sometimes being scared is okay, but letting lies hurt people you love is never okay.'" Before anyone could react, Colton stood up too. His 7-year-old frame straightened as much as it could, his chin lifted in determination. "I helped collect the receipts," he said. "Rosalie said we were being detectives for truth." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Rosalie reached back into the decorated shoebox, pulling out item after item. Each one felt like another nail being driven into the coffin of Garrett's carefully constructed lies. 6 months ago, my life had been completely different. Back then, I was Bethany Morrison, working double shifts as a cardiac nurse at Mercy General Hospital while raising 2 beautiful children on my own. Every morning followed the same familiar rhythm. Rosalie would shuffle into the kitchen with her hair sticking up in 12 different directions, asking if she could have pancakes, even though she knew it was a Wednesday, and Wednesdays meant cereal and toast. Colton would already be seated at the table, carefully arranging his dinosaur figures in what he called breakfast formation, making sure each one had a clear view of his cereal bowl. Our apartment wasn't much to look at from the outside. It sat on the 2nd floor of a building that had clearly seen better days, with windows that rattled when the wind picked up and radiators that clanged like ghostly drummers in the winter. But inside those walls, we had built something special. Rosalie's science projects covered nearly every available surface in the living room. Her latest creation, a volcano made from papier-mâché and far too much enthusiasm, sat proudly on the coffee table, even though it had already erupted 3 times and left stubborn baking soda stains in the carpet. Colton's Lego cities stretched across his bedroom floor in elaborate designs he mapped out on graph paper, complete with street names and building specifications. "Mom, did you know the human heart beats about 100,000 times a day?" Rosalie announced one evening while I helped her with homework. "That means your heart at work is super busy, helping other hearts keep working." "That's pretty amazing, Sweet Pea," I told her, even as my own heart felt like it had been working overtime, just trying to keep our little family afloat. The divorce from Garrett had been finalized exactly 3 months earlier, March 15th. I had circled the date on the calendar with a black marker, not in celebration, but as proof to myself that I'd survived. He'd left us for Sienna, his 24-year-old personal trainer, who posted motivational quotes on Instagram about living your truth and following your destiny. Apparently, Garrett's destiny involved abandoning his family for someone who thought protein shakes counted as a food group. "I need a fresh start," he'd announced one January evening, his suitcase already packed by the door. "This isn't working anymore, Beth. We both know it." What I knew was that "this isn't working" meant he'd found someone younger who laughed at his jokes about cryptocurrency and didn't remind him to attend parent-teacher conferences. The truth was, I felt relief when he left. The last 2 years of our marriage had been like walking through a minefield in the dark. Every word I said felt dangerous. If dinner was 5 minutes late, I was disorganized and setting a bad example for the kids. If I asked him to pick up milk on his way home, I was nagging and trying to control him. When I worked extra shifts to pay for Rosalie's science camp, I was choosing work over family. When I took a day off to attend Colton's school play, I was financially irresponsible. Then, 2 months after the divorce was finalized, everything changed. Garrett's parents, Walter and Vera Morrison, were killed in a car accident. They were driving home from their 50th wedding anniversary celebration in wine country when a drunk driver crossed the median. The loss was devastating, but what came next was even worse. Their will contained a clause Garrett had apparently known about all along. Their substantial estate, 3 rental properties and an investment portfolio worth over $2 million, would only pass to him if he had primary custody of any grandchildren. Without custody, everything would go to the charities they'd supported for years. Suddenly, the man who had forgotten Colton's 7th birthday and missed 12 of Rosalie's soccer games transformed into Father of the Year. He started showing up for visitation weekends with expensive gifts and grand promises. He enrolled the kids in costly summer camps without asking me, then used my inability to afford those same programs as proof of neglect. "Mommy," Colton asked one Sunday evening after coming back from Garrett's place, "why does Daddy keep taking pictures of our apartment?" "What kind of pictures, buddy?" "Everything. Our fridge, our cabinets, your closet, Rosalie's closet. He even took pictures of the bathroom medicine cabinet. He said he was playing a game." Rosalie looked up from her homework. "He asked me if I was happy here. When I said yes, he got mad and said I didn't understand what happiness really means." That should have been my wake-up call. But I was drowning in exhaustion, picking up extra shifts to pay for Ms. Delane, the only lawyer I could afford. She was so overloaded with cases that our conversations rarely lasted more than 5 minutes. My family couldn't help much from afar. My parents were in Oregon, where my father was recovering from hip surgery. My brother Nolan was in Maine, fighting his own custody battle after his ex-wife relocated there with their son. I was fighting alone, armed with nothing but the truth and the fragile hope that justice actually meant something in family court. The custody hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 o'clock sharp. I requested the day off 3 weeks in advance, knowing it would cost me not just my base pay, but the overtime I desperately needed to cover bills. My supervisor, Nancy, gave me that look, the one filled with pity instead of help. I arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, wearing my only suit. It was navy blue, bought 5 years earlier for job interviews. The hem had been mended twice, and if you looked closely, you could still see where Colton had once gotten marker on the sleeve. But it was professional enough. Ms. Delane met me on the courthouse steps, arms loaded with folders, her phone buzzing nonstop. "Bethany, I need to be honest with you," she said without looking up. "Thornley's going to come at you hard. He has a reputation for destroying mothers in custody cases. Answer honestly. Keep it short." Inside the courtroom, Garrett was already seated with his legal team. He wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, his hair freshly cut, looking every bit the successful businessman he pretended to be. Sienna sat behind him in the gallery, one hand resting protectively on her pregnant belly in a way that made my stomach churn. Mr. Thornley stood first, commanding the room like a predator circling its prey. "Your Honor," he began, "we are here today because my client, Mr. Garrett Morrison, has serious concerns about the welfare of his children while in their mother's custody." He opened a leather folder and began his methodical assault. "Mrs. Morrison," he said smoothly, "you work as a cardiac nurse, correct?" "Yes," I answered. "I do." "And how many hours did you work last week?" I felt my stomach tighten. I knew exactly where this was going. 62 hours. 62, he repeated slowly, as if the number itself were a crime. "And during those 62 hours, who was caring for your children?" "They were in school during my day shifts," I said. "My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, watched them for the 3 evening shifts." "Mrs. Chen," Thornley echoed, flipping a page, "a 73-year-old woman who uses a walker." "She's perfectly capable," I said, my voice firm despite the warning squeeze of Ms. Delane's hand on my arm. "She raised 4 children of her own." Thornley produced a photograph and held it up for the court to see. "This is your refrigerator, photographed this past Monday. Can you explain why it appears nearly empty?" My heart dropped. Garrett had shown up 3 hours early for pickup that day, using a key he'd somehow copied before returning it. The photo had been taken before my grocery delivery arrived. That picture was taken before my groceries arrived, I said. I shop online. My delivery comes Monday afternoons. How convenient, Thornley replied, smirking. And yet you have no proof of this supposed delivery. My bank statements, which show multiple overdraft fees in the past 3 months, he interrupted. How can you claim to provide adequately for your children when you can't even manage your own finances? Those overdrafts happened because Garrett stopped paying child support for 2 months without warning, I said, my voice rising despite myself. My automatic bills still processed. Mr. Morrison has provided documentation that he paid support directly to the children, Thornley countered smoothly, in the form of clothes and school supplies. Without my consent, I shot back, and those items never even came home. Thornley laid out more photographs. These images show your daughter wearing shoes with visible holes, your son in a jacket that is clearly too small. Is this your definition of adequate care? Rosalie refuses to wear new shoes, I said. Those are her lucky science fair shoes. I bought her 3 new pairs. And Colton's jacket was sewn by his grandmother before she passed. It's his favorite. Convenient excuses, Thornley said, turning to the judge. Your Honor, we have a mother who leaves her children with elderly caregivers, fails to maintain food in the home, can't manage basic finances, and allows her children to attend school in damaged clothing. Meanwhile, my client has remarried, has a stable home, separate bedrooms for each child, a full-time homemaker wife, and the financial means to provide everything they need. Judge Wendell adjusted his glasses and looked directly at me. Mrs. Morrison, do you have documentation for these grocery deliveries? Ms. Delane flipped frantically through her folders. Your Honor, we weren't aware this would be raised today. We can provide those records after the hearing. That seems rather late, the judge said, concern creeping into his voice. Thornley stepped in again, clearly sensing blood in the water. Your Honor, we also have evidence that Mrs. Morrison takes prescription medication that could impair her ability to parent. That's insulin, I blurted out. I'm diabetic. It's insulin. A condition she failed to disclose in her initial custody paperwork, Thornley replied calmly. The walls felt like they were closing in. Every explanation twisted, every truth reshaped into something ugly. Garrett sat back, that same satisfied smile on his face, the one he'd worn the night he told me no judge would ever give custody to an overworked nurse over a successful businessman with a stay-at-home wife. Judge Wendell frowned as he reviewed the documents in front of him. Mrs. Morrison, these are serious concerns. Before I make any decisions, I need to understand the full picture of your household. My throat felt raw, every defense sounding weak against Thornley's polished lies. That was when I heard it again. A small, steady voice from the gallery. Excuse me, Your Honor, I need to show you something important. Everyone turned. Rosalie stood there, clutching her decorated shoebox to her chest like armor. Colton was beside her, his hand wrapped tightly around her sleeve. Young lady, please sit down, the bailiff said, moving toward them. Children may not interrupt proceedings. But I have evidence, Rosalie said, real evidence about what my dad's been doing. Judge Wendell raised his hand. Wait, what's your name? Rosalie Morrison, she said. I'm 9 years old. That's my brother Colton. He's 7. And that's our mom. She's telling the truth. Garrett jumped up, his face flushing red. This is inappropriate. They're being coached. Sit down, Mr. Morrison, Judge Wendell ordered. He turned back to Rosalie. What evidence do you have? Rosalie stepped forward, her shoes squeaking softly on the polished floor. She opened the shoebox. My dad came to our apartment when Mom was at work, she said. He threw away our food and took pictures, but I kept all the receipts from when Mom bought groceries. She held one up. This one's from last Monday. Mom spent $247. She shops after her Sunday night shift because the coupons reset. That's a lie, Garrett shouted. I have proof, Rosalie said, her voice shaking but unbroken. Remember when you told me to download that game on my tablet? It recorded everything. She pulled the tablet out. You told me to lie, she said quietly. You said if I helped, we'd live in a big house with a pool, and if I didn't, Mom would go to jail. Colton spoke up then. He told me to say I was hungry at school, but Mom always makes us breakfast. Always. Ms. Delane finally stood. Your Honor, we request these items be submitted as evidence. Judge Wendell nodded. Bring the box here. Rosalie continued pulling things out. Receipts, notes, a notebook covered in unicorn stickers. I wrote everything down, she said. Every time Dad came over, every lie he practiced with us. Thornley tried to object, but Judge Wendell cut him off.
I know the difference between a coached child and one telling the truth.
Finally, Rosalie pulled out a digital recorder. She pressed play. Garrett's voice filled the courtroom. Tell the judge you're hungry at Mommy's house. The room went silent. When the recording ended, Judge Wendell looked at Garrett with controlled fury. Do you deny that is your voice? Garrett had nothing to say. Full custody is awarded to Mrs. Morrison, the judge said firmly, effective immediately. The gavel fell. 6 weeks later, our apartment felt lighter. Not bigger, not richer, just free. The shoebox sits on our mantel now. Colton labeled it in careful handwriting. The box that saved us. But it wasn't really the box. It was the 2 children who had carried it. 6 weeks had passed since that day in court, and our small apartment felt different now. Not bigger, not fancier, just lighter, as if someone had finally opened all the windows and let years of trapped air escape. The walls hadn't changed, but the silence had. It no longer felt heavy or watchful. It felt peaceful. Rosalie's science projects still covered nearly every available surface, but now she worked on them while humming softly to herself instead of intense, quiet concentration. Colton's Lego cities had expanded into the hallway, complete with a courthouse he proudly pointed out to visitors. According to the cardboard sign taped to its roof, truth always wins. Garrett was facing criminal charges for custodial interference, fraud, and witness tampering. His assets had been frozen pending investigation, which meant Sienna left him less than 2 weeks after the hearing. She posted on Instagram about removing toxic people from her life and choosing self-love over complicated situations. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered how close he'd come to stealing my children, not out of love, but for money. The real surprise came from Garrett's extended family. His sister Claire called me one evening, her voice shaking. Bethany, I had no idea, she said through tears. He told us you were keeping the kids from him. We believed him. She started coming by every Sunday after that. She brought Rosalie chemistry kits and helped her design experiments that were far more advanced than anything I understood. She brought Colton books about paleontology and listened patiently as he explained in great detail why the Tyrannosaurus Rex was misunderstood. Garrett's cousin Marcus, a lawyer himself, reached out and offered to help me recover the financial damage Garrett had caused. Family isn't about blood, he told me. It's about truth and loyalty. You and the kids are our family. A week later, I received a call from the executor of Walter and Vera's estate. There's a secondary clause in the will, he explained. If Mr. Morrison is found to be an unfit parent through legal proceedings, the grandchildren's education trusts activate immediately. Independent trusts, fully funded, managed until Rosalie and Colton turned 25. Rosalie's science camp was covered through graduate school. Colton's future was secure. Vera had known. Somewhere deep down, she had known who her son really was and had planned accordingly. One evening, as I tucked Rosalie into bed, she looked up at me with serious eyes. She was still wearing those sparkly shoes she refused to throw away. Mom, she asked quietly, are you mad at us for keeping secrets? Never, I said immediately. You were protecting our family the only way you knew how. You shouldn't have had to be that brave. I'm glad I was, she replied simply. Mrs. Brennan was right. Sometimes the truth needs a voice, even if it's a small one. I smiled. When did you get so wise? When I realized Dad was making you cry but pretending he wasn't, she said. You always stood up for us. It was our turn to stand up for you. Colton climbed into bed beside her, dragging his dinosaur blanket behind him. Mom, he asked softly, will Dad ever say sorry? I don't know, buddy, I admitted. Sometimes people get so lost in their lies, they forget what the truth looks like. That's sad, he said, curling closer to his sister. But we won't forget, right? Never, I promised. My brother Nolan flew in from Maine shortly after everything settled. He helped me refinance the apartment into my name and build a real budget. "You should have called me," he said, for what felt like the 100th time. "You didn't have to do this alone." I thought being strong meant handling everything myself, I told him. "That's what manipulators want," he said gently. "Isolation is how they win." He was right. For years, I had been drowning in Garrett's version of reality, where every struggle was my fault and every problem was proof of my failure. I'd forgotten that truth doesn't need to shout to be powerful. Sometimes it arrives in a shoebox carried by a 9-year-old girl in sparkly shoes. Ms. Delane took my case pro bono after the hearing. She's since used it in her law school guest lectures on recognizing custodial interference. "Your children didn't just save you," she told me once. "They may have saved dozens of other families." Last week, I finally filled the prescription I'd been skipping so I could afford Colton's inhaler. Standing in that pharmacy, I realized I'd been holding my breath for 7 years. Through the marriage, the divorce, the custody battle, I'd survived by making myself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. My children showed me that truth doesn't require permission to exist. The shoebox now sits on our mantle, redecorated with photos of our real family. Not the one Garrett tried to destroy, but the one we built from love, trust, and courage. Colton added the label himself, carefully written in marker, "The box that saved us." But it wasn't the box. It was 2 children who understood that love means protecting the people who protect you. An elderly neighbor who knew when justice needed a push. A grandmother who left behind more than money. She left tools to recognize and fight manipulation. Truth doesn't always win immediately. Sometimes it waits, gathering receipts, growing courage, finding its voice. But when it finally speaks, truth doesn't just win, it liberates. Our story isn't unique. There are thousands of parents, mostly mothers, fighting battles like this in family courts every single day. They're up against fabricated evidence, polished lies, and systems that too often confuse money with stability and exhaustion with neglect. They're told they're too poor, too busy, too imperfect to deserve their children. They're isolated, overwhelmed, and slowly trained to doubt their own memories, their own instincts, their own worth. For a long time, I was one of them. I believed that if I just worked harder, stayed quieter, explained myself better, things would eventually improve. I thought patience was strength and silence was maturity. I didn't realize that silence was exactly what Garrett needed to keep rewriting reality in his favor. Manipulators thrive in isolation. They count on you believing that no one will listen, that no one will believe you, that you're overreacting or being dramatic. They depend on your fear of being seen as difficult, emotional, or unstable. They win by convincing you that your voice doesn't matter. But truth doesn't disappear just because it's ignored. Sometimes it waits. It waits in grocery receipts, tucked into a shoebox, in dates carefully written in a child's notebook, in recordings saved just in case. It waits in small hearts that know something is wrong even when they don't yet have the language to explain it. And sometimes, when the moment finally comes, truth doesn't rise up in a loud, confident adult voice. Sometimes it comes wrapped in glitter and carried in the small, shaking hands of someone who loves you enough to be brave when you can't be. I still think about that courtroom, the way Rosalie stood there in her sparkly shoes, holding that shoebox like it was heavier than it looked. I think about Colton, standing beside her, terrified and determined all at once. They weren't trying to be heroes. They were just trying to protect the person who had always protected them. Love taught them that. The shoebox stays on our mantle as a reminder, not of the pain, but of the courage it took to end it, of the moment truth finally had its day, of the realization that justice, while imperfect and often delayed, can still arrive when someone refuses to let lies be the final word. If you're reading this and fighting a battle that feels impossible, hear this. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Reach out even when it feels uncomfortable, even when you've been taught that asking for help is weakness. Truth has a voice. Sometimes it's yours. Sometimes it comes from unexpected allies, and sometimes, miraculously, it comes from your children, reminding you that you are worth fighting for. Don't give up. Lies, no matter how carefully crafted, eventually collapse under the weight of their own deception. And when truth finally speaks, it doesn't just win the argument, it gives you your life back.